Jacques Turgot was in a bind. Thousands of miles away, the struggling British North Americans were in the midst of a revolutionary war against France's interminable foe, perfidious Albion. France and England had been the natural foes in virtually every conflict going for the past century, and England had only a little over a decade prior taken vast swathes of territory from France at the conclusion of the Seven Years' War, including its territories in what is today Canada. A massive humiliation and loss of territory many in the French court were eager to avenge. The young king, Louis XVI, was being encouraged to assist the American rebels. However, Turgot was of the opinion French finances simply could not bear the additional billion livres involvement in the conflict would entail. He was right. And when arguably the greatest throne in Europe was toppled, it was debt and its consequences that were at the heart of it. Like every great event in history, of course, the causes of the French Revolution were multiple and many, and have produced an avalanche of scholarship devoted to explaining why it happened. Before diving too deeply into this second lecture, therefore, devoted to the French Revolution, the event that kicks off the long 19th century, I want to just touch on some of the explanations generally given. I want, however, to do so in a general fashion, because while the first quarter or so of this lecture will be devoted to diving into the specifics of what happened in France during and after the Revolution, these causes of the French Revolution are going to reappear across the story of European history we're going to be weaving as we make our way through the long 19th century. So first, let's talk about the combination of social inequality and fiscal mismanagement. France, like many of its neighboring monarchies, had a rigid social hierarchy with privileges and burdens distributed unequally among the different classes. The nobility and clergy, or the first and second estates, enjoyed significant privileges while the majority of the population, essentially the third estate or the commoners, faced heavy taxation and economic hardships. Much of the wealth of the kingdom was actually beyond the ability of the king to tap into, leading to increasing levels of borrowing and squeezing of the poor peasant class. In terms of fiscal mismanagement, the French crown had not only undertaken a series of costly wars, most importantly the recent wars of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 48, the aforementioned Seven Years' War, 1754 to 63, which that was the really big one, and then the British-American War for Independence, 1775 to 83, we mentioned in the beginning, but it had done so in a disorganized and inefficient manner, lacking a Bank of France to finance these activities as efficiently as possible, a la the Bank of England there across the channel. The French crown had lacked even proper accounting ledgers of how much was owed and precisely how much and on what terms to whom, etc. So things were very bad and their borrowing costs were very high, twice as high as that of England. But it got worse because then there was the cost of supporting the monarchy, who oddly enough had taken to spending money it couldn't afford in order to essentially keep up the appearance that it was not, in fact, totally broke. So no surprise when this proved totally untenable, and an economic crisis developed as the 1780s wore on. As one might imagine, this situation was not a pleasing one to the commoners. The peasant farmers or small artisan craftsmen, the nobility and clergy paid no taxes, and if you had any complaints, well, they ran the local courts, and you can guess what kind of a hearing you were going to get. Widespread dissatisfaction with the monarchy's rule and resentment toward the privileged classes fueled social unrest. And while you might think the nobility, for example, might be on board with, trying to help the relatively young, inexperienced, and frankly kind of foolish King Louis out by ponying up some money in additional taxes, to try and relieve some of the pressure building within the system, you must understand that the king, virtually all kings, had in reality to constantly be battling with their nominal vassals for obedience and support. And oftentimes, this meant granting and honoring certain rights in exchange for that support. That is, for example, where a lot of the so-called free cities of the Holy Roman Empire came from. A monarch or bishop or someone was in a tight spot financially. In exchange for a nice big chunk of change, that town or city received this special status, which continued, albeit with increasingly less frequency into the 20th century. But I digress. The point is that the monarchy, all the monarchies paying attention, even the most conservative, were looking around at this period in time and trying to make some reforms. These newly industrializing wars we mentioned last week that were increasingly global in scale were really taking a toll, and clearly some things needed to change. However, the French nobility would not budge an inch, and in fact, they forced out a series of ministers put in place by Louis with the hopes of making some relatively tentative reforms. Things like reducing royal expenditures, i.e., their allowances, rationalizing taxation, i.e., taxing the people with the actual money, and liberalizing trade, i.e., cutting into all the sweet monopolies and subsidies the handful of commercial elites, usually themselves nobles or newly ennobled in exchange for another of those nice big chunks of change, had carved out for themselves. Again, unsurprisingly, a single minister could do very little, especially with a king as weak as Louis in his corner. Louis folds, and ministers like Turgot, who we met in the opening, the one stressing about even dipping a toe in the waters of the American Revolution, get the axe. Not literally, although the axe will come out later. Let's pause briefly here to take a look at our first slide. If you look on PowerPoint, you'll see the PowerPoint there on Blackboard. Because this map of what historians call Ancien Régime France, and this literally translates to old regime. And so in your text, I believe Hobsbawm will variously refer to the Ancien Regime in this or that country. That's just, he's gesturing toward this old pre-1789 order across Europe. And this is Ancien Regime France specifically on that map. As you can see, there are many little political entities. It isn't the Holy Roman Empire, which I'll show you next week, which had hundreds of different authorities. But each of these little spots in France had their own taxing and regulating authorities, which, as you can imagine, really hindered commerce and the development of industry. We also have some flags on there. Interested vexillologists among you can note the French Bourbon banner, that is the golden fleur-de-lis on the blue background. Just to be clear, I could not, in the time allotted to me, find a better map than this one. I would like to, if I teach this class again, to really dig around through scholarly texts about the French economy of the period to find a really, really detailed map, because really, I think the situation is even worse than this map illustrates. Just moving through here, anyway, as we were saying, all these pressures were building within the system, and then a series of bad harvests come along to add food scarcity and even more economic hardship into the mix, because now the prices on food are soaring, even on bread, the staple of the French peasant diet. Added to this, there are many Enlightenment ideas floating around, ideas of liberty and equality, the general will, writings by thinkers like Rousseau and Voltaire, which questioned traditional authority and advocated for more equitable, rational governance. None of this was ordained by God. They said, just look around. This isn't fair or rational for you to put up with. You have rights, and further, you have the right to assert them. Power grows up from the people, not down from God. Extremely radical stuff. Okay, so while it has become to some degree very fashionable to assert the idea of path dependency, that is, a variety of forces were now so arrayed that what happened next was a foregone conclusion, inevitable if you will, it really does look like on the eve of 1789 in France, some pretty serious trouble is brewing. And forced by financial necessity to summon the Estates General, Louis quickly loses control of what was always going to be an extremely delicate situation. Because you see, when the king calls a parliament or an Estates General, this is everyone's basically one chance to lodge their complaints. The king is only calling this assembly because he's really in a bind and needs cash fast. He's in a bad enough situation to have called this assembly, the first in almost 2 centuries. So the time to extract concessions is now. And this is what the Third Estate in particular try to force. Adoption of a constitution, explicating limiting the powers of the king, and the end of feudal privileges, essentially tax reform. And then they want the estates to vote by the head rather than, as was the case, voting by the estate. That is, instead of voting by number, the estates vote as corporate bodies, blocks. So they're easily blocked. The Third Estate is easily blocked by a combination of the first 2 estates, the nobility and clergy, who simply vote everything down 2-1, because their interest in preserving the status quo is pretty much perfectly aligned. The Third Estate is locked out on orders of the king, and rather than capitulate, they effectively secede, declaring themselves the true national government, and boy, do things snowball from there. Now, I'm in danger of being sucked into events in France in 1799, so I want to pull back and just quickly review what we've gone over. Because again, you have the same thing going on all over the continent, more or less over the next 60 years, until the revolutions of 1848 and the series of settlements that follow from them. So, speaking generally, you have these highly rigid, unequal societies which are legally unequal, not meritocratic, and not professionally or efficiently run, fiscally, militarily, etc. These are essentially, as in the case of France, a swollen medieval kingdom with guilds dominating the professions, lots of local prerogatives, barriers to internal trade, the movement of goods and people. This ultimately is what the revolution in France is going to destroy, not only in France, but eventually everywhere else. The personal, unprofessional, and inefficient is going to increasingly give way to the impersonal, the professional, and the efficient. Remember what we talked about last week about the highly competitive polycentric environment of Europe. Adaptations that increase war-making or survival capacity must be adopted if you are not to be dominated or even swallowed up by your neighbor. Literally during this period, you had an example of this failure happening right in front of you. The Kingdom of Poland being literally dismembered by its more powerful absolutist neighbors, Prussia, Russia, and Austria. Wiped off the map, its territories divided, and literal mention of its prior existence forbidden by the treaties that accomplished its final destruction. For those of you thinking about a research topic, this phenomenon known as state death is very interesting. And Norm Davies, one of the historians you're reading later this semester, has an excellent book about some of these lesser well-known, quote-unquote, vanished kingdoms, as he calls them. But okay, before extending further the examination of this transformational process to the other extant political entities of Europe in the late 18th, early 19th century, the origin and development of which we traced up to this point last week, I'm going to take you on a sprint through 20 years of craziness in France because this is what is going to drive the process. And indeed, when it comes to Napoleon, literally going to lay the foundational stones across Europe in places like Italy, Slovenia, Germany, even as far away as Greece. So ready or not, here we go. So Louis, after completely losing control of the situation, initially decides to just kind of sit back and nod along with the plans of the liberal, that's small l, liberal revolutionary planners, those inspired, for example, by Montesquieu or the Revolution in the United States. Things look headed for something like a constitutional monarchy at that point. However, Louis, he decides to attempt to flee the country. He is recognized in caught, however, and this is called the Flight to Varennes, if you want to look it up, if you've never heard of it before. And this seriously undermined the position of the moderate or liberal revolutionaries who had been advocating for moderate reforms within the framework of the existing monarchy, much as what happened over the course of the latter half of the 17th and 18th centuries in England, which became Great Britain in 1707 following the Act of Union between England and Scotland. So I'm just going to start calling that Great Britain there. But I digress. Well, while I do move us on to our next slide here, there's just a little bit of a timeline there if you want to take a look at it. It kind of plots some of these political changes. The attempt by King Louis XVI to escape and his subsequent apprehension having fueled distrust among the revolutionaries and the public toward the monarchy, shattering the hopes of those who had previously believed in the possibility of a compromise between the monarchy and the revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, it strengthened the position of the more radical factions within the revolutions, including the Jacobins and proponents of more drastic change, such as the complete abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of a republic. A quick note on the geopolitical situation, as it is about to become central to our story. At this point, there are essentially 5 great powers: France, Austria, Great Britain, Russia, and way behind them, Prussia. That's key information, so just lock it away. Sorry to Spain, Portugal, and the Ottoman Porte, but this is the historical convention, and it's correct enough for our purposes. Now, Marie Antoinette's brother was Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II of Austria, and in response to the situation following the flight in Varennes, that is the increasing hostility towards the French monarchy, specifically in Paris, Emperor Leopold II feels obliged to issue the Declaration of Pillnitz in August of 1791. Along with King Frederick William II of Prussia. The Declaration of Pillnitz was a statement that expressed concern for the safety and well-being of the French royal family and declared an intention to intervene in France if the safety of the king and queen were in danger. It wasn't explicitly a direct threat of invasion, and it was intended really as a diplomatic move, kind of a face-saving move, aimed at warning the government against harming the royal family and to kind of deter any potential harm. He was Marie Antoinette's brother, after all. But he was really loving the spectacle of his Bourbon rivals being roiled and weakened and dragged down by self-made domestic travails. They were rivals, after all, even though they were nominal allies. They had been enemies for a long time, and the alliance was not particularly popular. However, the French revolutionary government, led by the National Assembly, interpreted the Declaration of Pillnitz as an act of aggression and an interference in France's internal affairs. Surprise, surprise. This heightened tensions between revolutionary France and the other European powers, especially monarchies concerned about the spread of revolutionary ideals beyond France's borders, most specifically in the Austrian Netherlands, which is actually intimately tied to all of this, although we don't really have time to go into why. But ultimately, the Declaration of Pillnitz does nothing to improve the situation of Louis, Marie, and the rest of the royal family, while doing much to exacerbate the tensions between revolutionary France and the monarchies of Europe, as well as aiding the rise of the real social radicals in Paris. All of this contributing to the onset of the Revolutionary Wars, which begin in 1792. Following another quite belligerent declaration by the Allies, this one courtesy of the Duke of Brunswick, the eponymously named Brunswick Manifesto, where he says straight up, if anything happens to the royal family, we're going to put Paris to the sword, thereby beginning more or less 2 straight decades of war. Now, as I just hinted, war really radicalizes the situation in Paris, although perhaps it is better to say it radicalizes things even more. There is good scholarship, for example, showing that the intensity of the terror of the Jacobins, like Robespierre and Saint-Just, really tracks with the fortunes of France on the battlefield. But even on a more basic level, from our own time and experience, having grown up as a child of the terror wars in the aftermath of 9/11, I can tell you that the rally around the flag effect is very strong. That urge to fight the perceived enemies of the country in danger. War, in the words of the libertarian historian Robert Higgs, is the master key of the modern state. You can get anything, requisition anything, men, money, in the name of national emergency. True now, was true then, and the new revolutionary government arms the people, an innovation we spoke about last week, tears up the old order, and it's off to the races. While they do not go too far, beginning to kill every real and imagined opponent of the regime, and you can see on the slide that the second revolution, that of 1793, puts the Jacobins in power. It's followed by a series of conservative reactions. Essentially, the pendulum of revolution has swung too far in the direction of social revolution. And so you have the Thermidorian reaction, the coup of Thermidor, all of those dates, all of those words that you see there, like Prairial, Thermidor, Floreal, Brumaire, those were the months of the new revolutionary calendar. So those are just the substitutes for like June, July. So they're very cool sounding, but it's just the months of the year. So 6th Thermidor would be like the 6th of the month of Thermidor. So the Thermidoran reaction is what results in the Jacobins being hunted down and killed. And then there are a series of attempts by the Directory, a collection of those initial conservative reactionaries, and they're not like real super conservative, they're not like monarchists or anything, but they're on more to the center of the revolutionary group, trying to fend off a series of counter coups, such as Fructidor, Floreal. They're essentially whacking the left and right respectively, trying to stay in power, and eventually they're supplanted by Napoleon, the most powerful and successful readily available general. And that's the coup of Brumaire in 1799, which is just a hop, skip, and a jump to the proclamation of the empire and his emperorship in 1804. We'll return to Napoleon in just a moment, but about getting an army on the battlefield. Necessity is the mother of invention, and unsurprisingly, just about every nobleman who could hightailed it out of France when things started to go south. Most of the most important would gather around the deposed king's younger brother Charles, who will some 30 years later eventually become king of France himself, at least until he too will be overthrown. 19th century France. I wrote one of my graduate theses on France's political history during the period, and boy is it fun. But anyway, the loss of the nobles meant the loss of all the officers. Really, anyone with any experience fighting or conducting military operations is broadly true. There were still some who had stuck around. Of course, fighting is, just kind of a process of trial and error at that point, and the revolution winds up finding some good generals, and one very good one in particular in Napoleon. However, just exactly how good these generals are is kind of open to question, since they were leading armies, at least initially, that were unlike anything that had been seen in Europe. These mass conscript armies, that is, arming hundreds of thousands of peasants and throwing them in human wave attacks against these small professionalized armies of the Austrians, the Spanish, etc. Remember, this is an age of really slow-firing muskets and highly underdeveloped artillery. And in the probably apocryphal words of Napoleon, although I've seen it all over the place, quantity has a quality all its own. So this isn't to say Napoleon lacked strategy, tactics, or political acumen. He did have all these. His strategy of the central position, that is driving in between two armies and then dispatching them one at a time rather than allowing them to link up. His ability to woo the Tsar of the Russias for a while to his side, although he was ultimately undermined and betrayed by his own foreign minister, the great survivor of French political life at the time, Talleyrand. It's simply to say that unlike Julius Caesar, who when he fought his wars for control of Rome, he was fighting against armies he was fighting armies essentially the same as his own, but for their experience under his command and his own decision-making. It isn't until Napoleon tries to invade Russia that he starts to encounter situations where sheer numbers are just not going to be enough, to say nothing of his complete failure to account for logistics and basic geography. He also displayed plenty of political incompetence, such as his ordering of the kidnapping and killing of the Duke of Einon and Louis Antoine in 1804, which seriously harmed his international reputation. This is the one about which Fouché says, worse than a crime, that was a mistake. As well as his removal of the Spanish monarchy, an attempt to govern most of Europe with his own siblings placed on a variety of thrones, including in Spain. Then there was the disaster of the continental system, his attempts to impose on the rest of Europe a system in which all economic life was revolve around France, and none were to have any dealings with Great Britain. This was a total disaster and failure. Everyone cheated, including his own siblings, from the very thrones he had put them on. But it has to be said, if you're going to be ruled by a military dictator, people can do and have done a lot worse than Napoleon Bonaparte, because he is quintessentially a so-called Enlightenment despot. That is, someone like Frederick the Great of Prussia, or Catherine the Great of Russia, or Joseph II of Austria, rulers who embraced Enlightenment ideas and principles while maintaining absolute or autocratic rule, using their power to implement reforms and policies inspired by Enlightenment ideas such as reason, tolerance, legal reform, social progress, changes in governance and education with the intention of improving the well-being of their subjects. In the examples already given, this was done with the goal of modernizing and strengthening their states, so it was hardly altruistic. And this case of Napoleon is no different. The nature and intent of the reforms varied. Sometimes he thought it was a good idea for the people, but most often he thought it would help him consolidate rule or strengthen the army, or he thought it would be a nod to public opinion, which would make him more popular, etc. Napoleon Bonaparte implemented a series of significant reforms in France as part of his efforts to consolidate power and modernize the country during the Napoleonic era, that's 1799 to 1814. There's the Napoleonic Code, which was the codification of French law, emphasizing principles of legal equality, protection of property rights, and individual freedoms. People were big fans of this. He centralized administrative authority, dividing the country into departments, each with a prefect appointed by the central government, thus streamlining governance, enhancing efficiency, and ensuring greater control over local affairs. He instituted educational reforms to create a more skilled and merit-based bureaucracy. The University of France was established to oversee and coordinate this, while secondary education too was standardized and a centralized curriculum was implemented to promote a sense of national identity. You were not any longer a subject of the king, but a Frenchman and citizen of the Grand Empire, although Napoleon will eventually start calling his fellow citizens subjects as things go along and he becomes emperor. There were obvious financial reforms made. The establishment of the Bank of France being one of the first things he did to regulate the currency and manage state finances. He ordered great networks of roads built. He standardized measurements, all of which made commerce easier to transact. And then he brought the Catholic Church in from the cold, something which made him and his descendants particularly popular with a certain key rural constituency. We'll see this again when we see Napoleon III later on in the 1850s. All right, so these efforts at modernizing and strengthening France worked wonders at increasing the power of the French state, and they would be more or less eventually aped, however reluctantly, by all the other great powers apart from Great Britain, which already had a lot of these things going for it already. In fact, some of the territories conquered by Napoleon would receive this treatment directly from the general turned emperor. For example, the Italian peninsula will be totally reorganized, as well as the Germanic states of Central Europe. I really do not want to get bogged down in these, and I don't want to go light on their treatment either, because they're highly instructive, and we're going to talk about them a lot in our next lecture and in the lecture after that. So for now, let me just say a few quick things about their time under Napoleon and save the rest for the next couple of lectures. Okay, so one thing to understand about the growth of nationalism across the continent in places like the Italian peninsula or the German polities is that it grew not only out of an ideological apiary, that is, a mimicking of the national idea, that there are recognizable people with certain ties to one another and a certain place, which had grown up in France during the Revolution. Perhaps even more importantly, it grew out of the shared experience of previously seemingly very different peoples living under French occupation and, frankly, domination. Whatever else he might have done for you, gave you better local justice system, whatever the case might be, Napoleon's administration was about using the conquered territories to enrich France and feed its armies, not things that are going to make you very popular, things like looting national artifacts. How did all the great Northern Italian Renaissance art wind up in the Louvre in Paris? Well, wonder no more. Apart from being occupied, however lengthy or brief a given territory's experience of this was, there was also the matter of military-aged men of these locales growing closer together from their time spent both fighting for and against Napoleon. For all of these reasons, then, all of a sudden the difference between a Bavarian, and a Hessian, or a Florentine and a Roman, previously viewed as pretty much unbridgeable, whatever they might have in common, suddenly didn't seem like that wide a gap to cross when you're being dominated by these foreign Frenchmen. And especially in the case of the Germans and Italian, the realpolitik among them recognized that if they could not unite in a single stronger geopolitical entity, they would continue to be easy pickings for the stronger, already unified states of the period, such as the French, English, and Russians. Nationalism and the state-making process are fascinating, and we will have much more to say on them here in the near future in our lectures. But for today, I need to hasten to wrapping up the actual goings-on of the half-dozen wars Napoleon and the British are going to insist everyone fight for the first decade and a half of the 19th century. Now, as you can see from the slide of the 7 so-called wars of the coalition, 6 of them were essentially fought once Napoleon came to power, and this was for a variety of reasons. One of them being that Great Britain, after the Peace of Amiens, didn't really like the settlement and refused to come to terms with Napoleon, and were constantly trying to stir up trouble for him. Also, Napoleon really thought France would be safest and strongest dominating the continent. I might as well explain why all this is here, because it's going to come up repeatedly in the course of World War I. The British grand strategy was based on preventing any single power from dominating Europe, and the reason being that they could then use those resources to create a navy powerful enough to challenge the British Empire, which was sea-based, and that was considered unacceptable. We're going to see that again in the run-up to World War I and the arms race between the British Empire and the German Reich. In fact, although the period is named for Napoleon, and the narrative of the period is generally told as one of continual French triumphs, this Napoleonic period of the early 19th century, really it's at this point that Britain really cements its status as the preeminent global power, a position it will then spend the next 100 years building upon and defending. Because while Napoleon was master of the continent, albeit briefly. London's effective blockade of the continent on and off for 2 decades meant that it had all the time it needed to take its pickings of all its rivals' best foreign possessions, France chief among them. When the war ended, they would give some of these possessions back to the French or Dutch, etc., such as Guadeloupe and Martinique, in order to help their economies and to foster some degree of conciliation. But anything of real strategic importance, for example, was retained by the British. Places like Malta, which they took from the French, and Ceylon, which they took from the Dutch in modern days, Sri Lanka. Anyway, apart from London's stubbornness, there are a combination of reasons for Napoleon's eventual defeat in 1813 and his final defeat in 1815. First, the powers you see listed on the slide, which again, that's on Blackboard, the second lecture. They keep combining to resist him. That's Great Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, the four other great powers we talked about earlier, as well as guerrilla and resistance forces in places like Spain and the Italian peninsula, as well as the German states. These states are also reorganizing themselves internally, essentially aping the French in order to be more effective power projectors, something we've referred to repeatedly today. And lastly, and maybe most critically, Napoleon just can't stop fighting people after the wars resume in 1802. In 1812, with all of Europe at least nominally under his control, finally, he invades Russia, in part in an attempt to stop the big leakage of the continental system. Again, nominally under his control, because Spain and Portugal are definitely not totally under his control. You have the British running wild in the Iberia, stirring up trouble in the old kingdom of the two Sicilies as well. And as Napoleon himself had remarked earlier, while his enemies could suffer 100 defeats, a single defeat was all it would take to undo him. And well, he was right. He suffers that critical defeat. And though he is initially invited to remain Emperor of France by the powers, albeit with France's territorial conquest virtually all given up, he refuses it, prompting the Sixth Coalition to invade France itself. Paris is surrounded and surrendered by a provisional government, which had been declared following Napoleon's decisive defeat at the Battle of Leipzig, the so-called Battle of the Nations. It was massive. It involved 5 armies, and it was the largest battle until World War I. Napoleon is ultimately pressured into surrendering. They essentially tell him it's all over. Of course, Napoleon will return from his exile from the island of Elba in the Mediterranean, and for 100 days, it looks like the Bourbon Restoration, which we'll be talking about next time, is going to be quite brief. But Napoleon is defeated at Waterloo by the remobilized Allies, essentially by the timely arrival of the Prussians. But there you have it, the whirlwind of the Revolution and Napoleon. Bonapartism, a political ideology characterized by a mix of authoritarian rule, populism, and focus on economic development, will live on, albeit at the margins of French political life, until the 1840s, when the torch will be taken up by Napoleon's nephew. But that is a story for another time. Quickly here, I have a visual of the First French Empire at its greatest extent, which you may ponder at your leisure. Of course, this lecture in PowerPoint, they're already up on Blackboard. Wednesday, when we meet, we'll be talking about the Congress of Vienna, essentially the conference of the major powers that concludes the Revolutionary and Napoleonic period, and we'll watch as their attempts to reset the board of Ancien Regime Europe founders and fumbles its way toward the great revolutionary year, 1848, the Great Awakening, the springtime of peoples. This is a radical departure of everything that's come before, this national question. And so I'll let the Chinese premier Zhou Enlai, in a reported conversation with then President Richard Nixon in the early 1970s, have the last word. On that last slide there, you'll see that in response to a question regarding the impact of the French Revolution, he responded, well, it's too early to say. Indeed. That's all I have for you today. Thanks a lot.